So how much did the Rings of Power series cost Amazon? How does it compare to HBO's budget on House of the Dragon? How much does the Tolkien Estate actually make? And who owns the rights to the Lord of the Rings franchise? Okay, so episodes of the Lord of the Rings Rings of Power series are out and I actually like it. And I know online everyone's kinda torn about it. There are some fans who hate the series, especially fans who have read the book, citing inaccuracies, all that. But for me personally, I haven't read the book and I'm the type of person who I don't really think too much about the logic of what I'm watching unless it's completely off field. As long as I had a great time, as long as it makes me feel certain emotions, as long as it moves me, I'm okay with it. But okay, so naturally, after watching this episode, I got curious as to how much the Tolkien Estate earned from this entire series. Like, how much did Amazon pay them for the rights? And it also made me wonder if Tolkien was able to enjoy any of his earnings or if he was able to enjoy the success of his books. The short answer is yes, he did in fact at least spend the end part of his life as a rich man. Not as rich as he would have been had he been alive when the films and the series were released, but still comfortably rich. It makes me feel good that he at least witnessed the popularity of his masterpiece skyrocket. When he passed, all of it was now managed by the Tolkien Estate. First managed by his family, but it gets kind of blurry for me. I've read all that I could about who owns which rights, but it's all over the place. But here's what I got. Basically, the Tolkien Estate still owns the underlying rights of the literature, but in terms of what you can do with that literature, like rights to produce movies, TV series, merch, board games, video games, theme parks, all of that was owned by the Saul Zaentz company. So they acquired these rights from a company called United Artists in 1976. United Artists acquired these rights from Tolkien 8 years prior. The Saul Zaentz company turned their ownership of these rights into a holding company, appropriately called Middle-earth Enterprises. Just right after Amazon was able to acquire the rights to produce the Rings of Power TV series, a company called the Embracer Group acquired these rights from the Saul Zaentz company, reportedly for around $750 million, which seems like a lot, but considering how much Amazon paid for the rights to produce the TV series, that feels like a steal. And so now the company that Amazon is dealing with is the Embracer Group. The Embracer Group is a Swedish multimedia company. They're predominantly in the gaming industry. They're in the business of acquiring these game development companies. So yeah, they're pretty massive. Now, as for the Rings of Power series, I was curious about how it compares to the flagship series of other companies. I mean, since Rings of Power is Amazon Prime's bet against HBO's House of the Dragon and Netflix's Stranger Things. Now, how do their budgets compare? Among the three, Rings of Power is the most expensive TV series, and I think it's one of the most expensive ever made. Amazon paid around $250 million to acquire the rights alone. And what's crazy is how little they got from that $250 million. The Rings of Power series is about what happened before the Lord of the Rings films, and fans are saying that all of it could have been based on the Silmarillion. But Amazon didn't acquire the rights to the Silmarillion. And what pisses fans even more was that Amazon did have a chance to acquire those rights. And so they basically paid a premium to buy the rights to the appendices of the Lord of the Rings books. They're basically just minimal scraps of info and a bunch of supplemental material. So that's what the Rings of Power series is based on. Essentially, any backstory of the Rings of Power characters that are already established in the Silmarillion, Amazon can't use any of that. That's why there are certain terms, certain characters, and specific events in the book that the TV series isn't allowed to explicitly say. So it's like, instead of mentioning the Philippines, the TV series is only allowed to say something like the archipelago in the Far East, something like that. And so fans, especially the ones who read the book, are pissed because a lot of what they're showing on Rings of Power contradicts stuff that Tolkien actually wrote in published books. But anyway, Amazon paid $250 million for those rights, and another $465 million to produce season 1, bringing it to a total of $715 million, which means that each episode cost around $90 million to make. Now compare that to HBO's House of the Dragon, that has a $200 million budget for its 10-episode season 1, or $20 million per episode. And you can also compare that to Stranger Things' $270 million budget, or $30 million per episode. These numbers by Rings of Power are huge, especially when you consider that the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy cost around $285 million to make, and the Hobbit trilogy cost around $620 million to make. So yeah, that's kind of the economics of it all. But here's an interesting story that I stumbled upon while researching the numbers. So did you know that there was actually a copyright battle that that, in a way, forced Tolkien to release the books in the US much earlier than he wanted to. Okay, so here's what happened. So around that time, although the books have gained popularity in the UK already, no one had yet to acquire the rights to print the books in the US. And so there was this publisher, Ace Books, and they really wanted to get these rights. Tolkien resisted, but the owners of Ace Books were really persistent in bringing the books to the US. And eventually, they were granted a limited 5-year license to import the books in the US. Ace Books kind of embraced paperback books, like that was kind of their thing. But Tolkien hated paperback books. In fact, he called them the degenerate form of books. But Tolkien didn't mind it as much since their deal was limited. But the folks from Ace Books started studying copyright law and they found a loophole. I don't want to bore you with the details, but basically what Ace Books did was that when their deal expired, when Tolkien didn't want them to continue printing in the paperback format, Ace Books just published their own version of the trilogy. Like they had their own book cover, they printed it on paperback, and they just went for it. And so Tolkien, he hated dealing with this whole thing. Like he was already ready to move on to other projects. But then he knew that if he didn't act on this, he would lose out on the sales that Ace Books was gonna be making. So he was like, you know what, even though I'm not in the mood to deal with this whole thing, might as well make money from it. And so he dealt with another publisher, one that would bring it to the US officially. Now the problem was, their version of the book covers, Tolkien wasn't happy with it, whereas the version that Ace Books was producing, it was making a killing in the US. Now I've read somewhere that Tolkien wasn't too fond of fans of the book, at least during that time. I think it's because they just demanded too much from the lore, or I don't know. I mean, you guys know how crazy fans can be sometimes. But because of this whole mess, Tolkien had no choice but to summon the might of the superfans, declaring that the version that Ace Books were producing were pirated, unofficial copies. The superfans came to his aid, and an entire movement to boycott the unauthorized version gained momentum. Eventually, bookstores started boycotting Ace Books. Like, they wouldn't sell their version of the trilogy, they were losing business, and their reputation was getting demolished. Ace Books succumbed to the heat of all this, and they were forced to agree to Tolkien's terms. They stopped producing their version, and they promised to pay royalties from what they earned from their version. So yeah, if Ace Books didn't do all that, who knows how differently things would have played out. I know this isn't the usual business segment, but my curiosity got the best of me, and this story about Tolkien just felt interesting enough to share.